All right, all right, all right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along tonight. We have David here in the flesh. He's travelled down from Perth to be with us, and he's going back tonight as well. So I think that deserves a super big, massive round of applause, please. And we even gave his car a wash on the way in with a bit of rain. You know, the old Albany welcome. Got to keep it classic.
That appeals to my Scottish ancestry, I think. The idea of a free car wash. It's like, you know.
Exactly.
It's worth the drive alone, you know.
It's home. Alrighty, so we'll begin with the acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land where we're gathered today, the Menang people. This beautiful Noongar Budja they have taken care of for thousands of years, and it's such a privilege for us to be able to gather here and share stories. I'd like to acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging. Thank you. David, I am a nosy person, and I love to start with finding out a little bit about young David and what his relationship to reading was.
Oh, young David. Okay. Well, I was very lucky because my father was in the armed forces, and so we moved a lot, and there were disadvantages to that. I think I went to like 6 different primary schools. But on the plus side, I think I went to grade 1 3 times, 3 different places. On the advantage of that was that my mum taught me to read and write before I went to school, so I was a big reader early on and wrote stuff down as soon as I could. The first book that really made an impression on me was called I Am David, and obviously given to me by someone who probably didn't know it was a Holocaust story. And it was pretty full on for a kid's book, but in a good way. But beyond that, I was more into comics, particularly when I grew up in Karratha a bit. When my dad finally left the armed forces, and we stopped there for a while. After my mum finally said, "That's it, that's enough moving." There were a lot of building sites, and my parents weren't big readers, so there weren't a lot of books at home, but you'd find old westerns and crime novels and comics left around the building sites, so that I made a kind of a collection and used to trade them at school. And it was good.
Brilliant. I don't know if you'd find those around construction sites now. I imagine people are probably on TikTok on their lunch break. And in my gentle stalking that you guys know I like to do, I saw that you grew up all over the place, and part of that was in Singapore. What was it like growing up internationally as well, or was that just normal?
Yeah, I don't really remember too much about it. So I spent my first year on a base outside of Newcastle, and my poor mum, who's from WA, and my dad got shipped off to Vietnam a week after I was born. And so she was all alone on this base, which was pretty. But she reckons the other women were great. They a lot of little babies around, so it was okay. But then when his tour was extended for another, because he was a career person, we were sent to Butterworth in Malaysia and then Singapore, and I think that was great because he could come home for R&R pretty close, and it was great for me for selfish reasons because my mum learnt to cook, really, really good. So I was unusual for little ginger white boys in Australia. I used to take satay sandwiches to school, and so we grew up eating really great Southeast Asian food at home. So it was but I mean, I've just been up in Ubud, and I think the thing that stayed with me from living in Singapore is I love the tropical heat, and when it rains, I get this strange kind of excitement. I can't really explain it except for the fact that it must take me back to when I was a little fella.
Tell us a bit more about being in Ubud as well for the Writers and Readers Festival.
Yeah, it's the first time I've ever been at. It's a great festival, really, really good. A lot of writers from a lot of different parts of the world, talking about a lot of different things, but every single panel I went to was fascinating. Really good moderators. So if anybody's interested in going to the Ubud Writers Festival, I recommend it. I mean, I don't know if I'll ever be invited back because I don't know if I'll ever write a book like Cutler that is related to Southeast Asian themes. but I'll definitely go again as a punter for sure. Yeah, fantastic festival.
Excellent. And you're going travelling again soon. What are you packing, reading material-wise, for your trip? Or what have you recently read?
That's a good one. So, yes, I already have started packing. I'm going to take Dusk, Robbie Arnott's latest. He's a writer I really, really love. I've got a book that I've been meaning to read for about 30 years, Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. Has anybody read that? Yeah. I've heard great things about it, but I've never had the time to. So I'm taking that. I'm taking a big fat kind of omnibus of crime stories and a couple of others as well.
It's a good mix.
Be taking a lot of books. Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be your entire weight allocation, as it should be. I'm moving at the moment, and I'm discovering that, boy howdy, 40 cartons of books is really heavy. Who needs the gym? So something else I'd like to hear a little bit about, touching on travel, is your background, because you've had a very diverse background as far as careers go. How would you say that has influenced your writing?
A lot. I suppose I did start writing around that time. So when I left school, I got a job at Paperbark on the mine site there for a while. That was my first job, just kind of general labouring job. And I didn't know if I was going to stay there, but it was the first time I was getting 4 meals a day. That was incredible, because the mess up there was, in those days, it wasn't fly in, fly out. You had to live there. It was a very strange environment. 2,000 men, I think 5 women, and 2 of them worked in the newsagents. It was a weird environment. But the night shift people would come back for their lunch just when we would all come back from the pub, so you could have a really nice pre-sleep dinner. It was an interesting kind of place to work, and it was the first place I really met a lot of people from countries like Syria and Sri Lanka and East Africa, and I hadn't really thought about travelling much, but talking to those guys kind of gave me the bug, and so I saved up $1,000. I thought that I felt like a millionaire, because this is in the kind of mid-'80s, and I just bought a one-way ticket to Bangkok, and I thought I was just going to go surfing for a couple of months, but it ended up being 10 years in just moving around the place. I tend to do everything to extremes, you probably noticed. And yeah, I spent most of my time in East Africa and Central Africa and West Africa and a few years in Japan. But so I'm old enough, so it's pre-internet years, so there wasn't anything to do except read. So I was one of those people who used to travel with half my book, half of my bag was made up of books. And so a lot of reading, and at a certain point I think I never started writing seriously, because I didn't really, that wasn't even on my radar as something to do. I just started making observations of things and trying to make sense of some of the crazier stuff going on with little anecdotes. And at a certain point I was working as a labourer for the Wellington Council in New Zealand, and my girlfriend at the time, her aunt was a famous New Zealand poet, and she said, "Oh, you should write some of them, turn them into stories." And so I did, and I sent them to Bruce Pascoe in Australia, and was lucky enough that he kind of liked them. So the stories, I never really wrote too much about things I saw and did, but I think being able to get on with lots of people and see, it was a great just experience, whether it influenced the writing or not, but I think it probably did.
Were there any of those stories from that time that really, like books that you'd read, that stand out to you now, or they kind of all just contributed?
Well, I used to read. So I suppose I'm a self-taught writer, and so I used to read. I'd find a writer I really liked, and then I would read everything that they'd ever written, and then I would find out who influenced them and who they liked, and then I'd read everything they'd ever written. So I worked in this kind of rhizomic reading pattern, and that wasn't necessarily a bad way to do it, but I didn't know any other writers. and even when had been writing and my stories were getting published, I still had never met another writer. I knew actors and I knew a lot of musos, but it wasn't until I moved back to Western Australia that I actually met another writer, which was quite a nice thing. I didn't even know there was a community kind of thing, which there really is in Australia. But so I was up there, typing away in Tokyo, and my friend was a, heavy metal, guitarist. To go and see him, Canadian, long hair, and it was great. But yeah, I didn't know any other writers, so I used to read in that kind of strange way. And then I started going to uni in my late 20s, and that was also really good because I got lots of reading ideas out of that too. Yeah.
I've just finished reading, to be honest, very embarrassingly, I'm blanking on the name. It was W. Somerset Maugham. I found it in the Gemini secondhand bookshop, and it was Travels with a Gentleman in the Armchair, something along those lines. And it was a non-fiction. It was about this writer's experience travelling around sort of Southeast Asia in like the 1930s as well. And you remind me of one of the characters actually who was doing the same thing, just travelling, adventuring, ended up being somewhere for 5 years and goes, I'm still gonna keep going. I could never do that. Every time I book travel, it is itemised. Fun fact, I've never relaxed once in my life. So in your book as well, you reference Travels with Charlie, John Steinbeck. This is the red car thing as well. Just before reading this book, I'd had 2 separate people recommend this book to me, and then I read it in the book and went, oh, hey, order it in. So I've got one on order. Can you tell us a bit about why you decided that specific text to include? Because you don't have lots of references in Cutler, but that one was used a few times.
That was just a little private joke to myself, because a friend of mine, James, used to own New Edition Bookshop in Fremantle, and he was always pressing that on me, and I kept losing. He'd give me a copy and I'd lose it. I'm not very organised, get lost in my car or something like that. So that was a little joke between James and myself, but also more broadly because of the idea of Monterey and the sardine fishery there, which had been fished out. So Steinbeck's was kind of related in that way, but yeah, really just to amuse myself. Probably not a very good reason. But
were there many other sort of little Easter eggs that only one person would know, or just yourself? You don't have to specify exactly what if you don't want to.
There's always a few, but I can't remember any.
Fair enough. And so this is with Freo Press, and you've had quite a few books published with Freo Press. What's it like working with them?
It's great, yeah. There's something really special about living in the same kind of city as your publishing house. My first 3 publishers were all in the eastern states, and they were great. I worked with some really good editors, and I learnt, because I'm a self-taught writer, I learnt a lot from those editors about the writing process. And in fact, when I teach writing now, strangely enough, and I find when I'm teaching writing, it's the editors I've worked with's voices in my head that I hear kind of most often. So it was great working with those Eastern States publishers, but it was all done by phone. I never really got to meet a lot of the people, and so when the opportunity came to work with a local publisher, it seems to have all the advantages and none of the disadvantages. And yeah, they've been great. Really good people. And my current editor, Georgia, is also an incredible editor as well.
It's technology is amazing and it opens so many doors, but there's just nothing better than actually being able to physically meet someone, is there? It's just different, yeah. And so just then you sort of referenced what you've learnt from those editors over the years. What does your writing process look like? Are you in a hermetically sealed chamber? Are you sticky notes everywhere? Just the laptop? What's the vision?
I'm lucky enough. I've got a little room in Fremantle, and I've had it for a long time. I was supposed to give it back after 5 years, but I've had it for 14 now. Pretty much because after 5 years, I got down on my knees and begged, because I'm quite superstitious, and I said, "Look, this room has given me 4 books in 5 years. Please don't take it off me." And also my kids were quite young and very noisy, and they took pity on me. They said, well, we're going to use it as a meeting room, Dave, so you can use it when there's no meetings. As it turned out, it was too small for meetings, so the chairs were piled up in the corner, but I still had my little corner, and then they just gave it back to me anyway. So I'm lucky enough to have that room, and so my process is pretty chaotic because I work full time, but most of my work is supervising PhD students, and so I get about 1 day a week to write, which is great. And because supervising PhD students, I can do a lot of that work at night, and so I kind of pinch another day, so I get about 2 days to work, and then often we'll just have half an hour before I go to work. I zip in and I write a chapter and do a bit of editing at night around the edges of things. So you notice in many of my books the chapters are very short, and that's because I may only have 40 minutes and I want to finish a chapter. So it's fortunately for me that is a good thing for pacing, but it's kind of accidental. It's not deliberate.
It's a happy coincidence. You do go hard, don't you? Working full time, 4 books in 5 years. Yeah.
Everything to extremes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then another thing that I really like finding out about as a reader is about epigraphs. Love them. Love finding out through this why they're there, if the author is happy to share why that particular quote resonated with you. You had one from Ernst Bloch. Yeah. Is that how you say his name?
As far as I know, it's something like Bloch. Bloch. Yeah.
I didn't think I had enough back of the throat happening. So, but yes, the process is made by those who are made by the process. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So he's writing. He was a kind of a Marxist thinker. He's writing about utopia, and it's kind of hopeful because the process is made by the people who are made by the process is a sad fact in many of our countries and our states today, when lots of our governments are captured by corporate interests and whatnot, and there's a lot of movement between corporate lobbyists and government and backwards and forwards. So in terms of the status quo, it's not particularly hopeful, but his kind of point, I guess, broadly speaking, is that change the people, you change the process, you can change the future. That's kind of what it is. So that's a little bit hopeful. But.
And in a more less sort of, I can't think of the word. Anyone got the word? No. This is why I normally need my sister to come along. She can mind read and shout it out for me. Getting down to it, who would win if they were to duke it out? Paul Cutler, Lee Southern, or Frank Swan, your protagonists across some of your books?
I think Frank would win because he'd get the other two to do it and just kind of and then grab them afterwards when they're exhausted. That's how I see it playing it. He played the smart game.
Yeah, excellent. Because it's something that you do wonder when you have a brilliant author who's written lots and lots of books, don't you? You kind of pit them against each other in your mind. And then the next thing I'd like to talk about is the genesis for this novel. What was the spark?
So this novel's a little bit of a departure for me because it's my first ever contemporary set story. All of the other novels have been either straight up historical novels set in the 19th century or Perth-based crime novels set in the 1970s, 80s and now kind of 90s. This one started, I guess, in failure, I suppose. I was going to be a writer in residence on a Sea Shepherd vessel off the coast of West Africa. I've been interested in some of the things they're doing. The way they describe it is move away from being kind of sea pirates. Some of their actions in the Southern Ocean, like literally getting in the way of Japanese whaling fleets, towards privateering. And it's a kind of a strange distinction, but I think it comes from some of you who know your history will know that Queen Elizabeth I, back in the 17th or was it the 16th century, piracy was illegal and punishable by death. But when people like Francis Drake came to her and said, can we raid those Spanish galleons and take, steal their gold? She was like, well, you can't be pirates, that's bad, but you can be privateers, which means she got her cut. And so that's kind of how it operated. So how that translates to what Sea Shepherd are doing is they are working on behalf of a lot of African governments and recently in South Pacific as well. So essentially patrolling or giving logistical support to African countries who don't have the Navy to secure their own territorial waters. So what that means is industrial fishing fleets can come into their waters and basically take whatever they want. Sometimes this has resulted in huge, football length fishing vessels working, literally within sight of the shore, literally taking food out of African people's mouths. So a lot of people, particularly in West Africa, fish protein makes up, 90% of the protein that those people eat. So what they've been doing there is acting on behalf of those governments, providing logistical support, taking the militaries of those governments on the ship. And so because they're privateers, they are not able to interdict or raid these fishing vessels themselves, but they do it. They take the military from those countries to the pirate vessels, and they do the arrests. So it's kind of logistical support. Yeah. And to me, that's always seemed like an interesting model, because I think a long time ago Bob Brown said that the status quo vis-a-vis environmental activism is it's important, but it's kind of failing, and the next, and it's kind of the subject of Tim Winton's Juice, actually, isn't it? Like, what there needs to be is, I think he called it a people's army, not non-violent, but organised, a group of people who are prepared to do things that are against the law, I suppose. And that's kind of what Sea Shepherd has been doing, and to some extent Greenpeace as well. To me, that's an interesting model, because the status quo clearly isn't working, certainly not on as far as our oceans go, certainly not in relation to industrial fishing. And I was going to write about that and use that as a springboard to write about, it's called philosophical ethology, our relationship with non-human others. So lots of other philosophers have been writing about this, but not in relation to marine animals. So I was going to talk about all of those things at the same time. But then COVID came, and so that kind of stymied the trip itself. And I nearly went anyway. Traditionally in my life, when I've got a choice between doing something that's maybe not that smart and doing the safe bet, I've gone for it. Whereas this would have been really bad, because I would have been stuck overseas for 2 years, and I don't think my marriage would have survived it. Yes. So I stayed, and I didn't get to do that research trip, but I took all the research and I turned it into Cutler, basically.
Yeah. So were you still able to go out with Sea Shepherd a couple of times?
No, but I've been in contact with Pete Hammerstead and those other guys, and they've sent me lots of material, but also lots of other organisations, and a lot of the research is, textual, I suppose, but there's a lot of information you can get from all the various NGOs, and so I've had a lot of help, and I acknowledge those people in my book. But I'm still planning to do that trip at some stage. I just got a fresh invitation, but as you know, there's a big institutional kerfuffle going on at the moment between Sea Shepherd and Paul Watson Foundation. So I've kind of been waiting for that to settle down a bit.
Yeah. And with that research process, obviously, some very heavy topics that you explore. How did you find sort of conducting the interviews and that sort of thing? That's all fun. I mean, the main problem was, like with any kind of narrative, a novel can feel like a big thing when you're writing it, but it's actually quite a small thing. Yeah. Usually, particularly when it's a research-based fictional work like this one, the problem becomes about what to leave out. And the sad thing about the world that I'm writing about here is that it's way worse than even though there's some quite dark material in the book, the reality is actually way worse, and the scale and the scope of it is way worse than I've been able to represent here, because you don't want it to be too dark and gloomy, whatever the kind of the reality. So but yeah, there's a lot of material out there, and a lot of
escapees. So for those of you who haven't read the book, I mean, one of the main themes is the issue of maritime slavery or modern day slavery. I mean, most people perhaps rightly think that slavery ended in the 19th century, but it's not the case at all. And certainly with fisheries, there's a very specific problem related to industrial fishing. These are the big fishing vessels, not our artisanal fishers who operate in Australia, but these are the big kind of international distant water vessels who can sail right around the other side of the world because they're heavily subsidised usually. It's a very resource heavy industry. The common statistic is that for every 2 tonnes of fish caught, it takes 1 tonne of diesel fuel or bunker fuel. So it's a very costly kind of thing to sail around the world to find fisheries that haven't been fished out yet. And one of the only costs that a captain can control in that instance is the cost of labour. So often fleets from Taiwan, Russia, China, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, they basically don't pay their sailors at all. They don't pay their crew. So they're essentially slaves. Sometimes these guys escape. One guy who's been quite widely written about, he escaped. He was a slave for 22 years. He was unfortunately a Rohingya fella, and they're in a very specific problem because the Burmese government doesn't give a shit about them and definitely doesn't want them back, so they won't intercede on their behalf. And this poor fella escaped 3 times previously, but every time he escaped he was arrested by the police and taken back to the fishing boats because there was a kind of cosy relationship. But Stella Maris in Thailand, they've kept records of the people that they've helped rescue. It's a great organisation. There's an office in Fremantle. There might even be one in Albany. I don't know. Is there? Yeah. So I mean, they've documented a lot of these cases, and they get about 1 escapee a week in, and they help them, and they try and help them get home. And 60% of them have seen one of their workmates murdered. Because these guys don't get paid, it's free labour, right? So if they don't work hard enough, they get beaten, and if they complain or try and escape, they often just get killed because they're easily kind of replaced. So, I mean, that's a kind of specific problem I was looking at with this book, and the scale of that was, I mean, there are hundreds. Nobody really knows how many, but there are hundreds of thousands at the very least of these men working in waters not too far from here. Not in Australia, because we have this kind of biosecurity thing where we don't let foreign fishing fleets into our waters. But maritime slaves have been found in New Zealand waters, and in Scottish waters, and in Irish waters, and in American waters, and every ocean basin around the world. This is kind of happening. So it's a big problem. But because these are distant water vessels, they often don't go into port. So some of these fellas haven't seen land for 5 years, and when they do go into port, they're chained like slaves, often. But a mothership will come and take all the fish off, and they can kind of keep they can basically keep fishing, and the show goes on. It's out of sight, out of mind. No one knows really because it's across the horizon. But that's kind of the hidden cost when you buy a can of tuna from the supermarket. That free labour. And without wanting to get on my high horse about it, it's estimated that we're all kind of culpable, because it's estimated that about between 20 and 34% of the fish imported into wealthy countries like Australia, the EU and America comes from these fleets, pirate fishing vessels, because obviously once a fish is filleted, who's to say whether it was caught on a boat or by a company that treats their workers well and sticks to their quota, uses the right equipment, or a pirate vessel that doesn't pay their workers at all, uses illegal gill nets, so on and so forth. So these kind of illegal fishers are laundered with legally caught fish, and so this is why monitoring where the fish comes from, which I think is coming before the Senate in a not too distant future, is an important thing, so we can kind of keep an eye on where the fish comes from, because otherwise it's a fish in a supermarket in a little plastic box, and who's to say where it's from?
Yeah.
And a very grim thing that, again, you've already touched on is the impact of government involvement and government subsidisation of those sort of very big, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the term, the really big ones that never sort of come back. Can you talk to us a little bit more about those? I have a quote here that I'm going to pop out there. So on page 217, it's no spoilers, why waste time fighting with Taiwanese people? The Chinese know they will win. Their fuel is paid by their government. Their government makes deals with every country to make sure they get all the fish, the squid they need. You don't need to invade a country to take what you want. You just need to be richer and clever. Lend other countries money so they get in debt. Bribe some of their politicians. Get those politicians to make laws and business contracts that suit you. When you get caught breaking the law, the politicians you paid will protect you.
Yeah, so because it's such a resource-intensive industry, most of these fleets wouldn't survive without government subsidies. So the EU subsidises distant water fishing vessels, particularly Spain, but so does South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. But the main kind of bad actor, I guess, in this area is China, just because they have seen it as a way of exerting soft power. So they have the largest fishing fleet. It's so large that it's more than all of the other fishing fleets put together. Nobody really knows, but it's something like 30,000 big industrial fishing vessels and about 3,000 or 4,000 super trawlers, so massive boats, and they tend to operate in kind of large groups, and often with a member of the Chinese Navy or Coast Guard. So they often will not go into other countries' territorial waters. They do definitely use slave labour. But has anyone seen the photographs of the Galapagos at night taken by satellite? Yeah, you can Google it. It's quite startling. So at a certain time of year, a huge Chinese fishing fleet of about 4,000 vessels goes to the Galapagos because the squid are on, right? And they circle. They sometimes go into the Galapagos exclusive economic zone, 200-mile zone. They sometimes do, but generally they tend to go around. They encircle it, which is not great because they get a lot of whale sharks on the way out. But there are so many that satellite photos at night, it looks like a perfect kind of ring around Galapagos territorial waters. And the problem with that is not just the kind of the fish caught, but if you've got 4,000 fishing vessels staffed by slave labour, you got 4,000 vessels with 10 people on board. So all of that rubbish, the rubbish is not recycled; it just goes straight in the ocean. So that all washes up on the coast of eastern South America. So if, to use a stupid example, if you got 4,000 vessels, 10 on each, everyone eating one packet of 2-minute noodles a day or drinking one water bottle, that goes straight in the ocean. That's over a 2-month kind of season, that's tens of millions of the plastic pollution going into the ocean, let alone the kind of the marine kind of damage, certainly to whale sharks and others.
And in Cutler, our protagonist is exploring the disappearance of an observer on one of the vessels. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of observers? Are they only in place where there's an agreement?
Yeah. So some fisheries, as a way of making captains do the right thing, they enforce. So every fishing vessel has to have a fisheries observer on the vessel. So the PNA or the South Pacific kind of cartel, they do that. So residents of those particular nations are on every kind of vessel. Unfortunately, though, it's one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, and it's almost impossible to get insurance for it, because as you'd appreciate, if you're alone on a fishing vessel and you're from Papua New Guinea or from Palau and you're on a Taiwanese vessel and the captain starts catching sharks when they're not allowed to, or goes over their quota or starts breaking whatever rule they want, you're in a very precarious position, because if you report on that, your life can be in danger. So a lot of fisheries observers end up going overboard. Certainly off the coast of West Africa, it's pretty common. And so I have my main character, Paul Cutler. The premise for him going out to this fishing vessel in the Western Pacific Ocean is that he's trying to investigate what happens to a marine scientist and fisheries observer who also happens to be the son of a fishing magnate, an Australian fishing magnate. And so he turns up on the vessel, doesn't really know what to expect. He comes from a policing background, but he's never really been on an industrial fishing vessel before. And yeah, so he's a bit shocked. Nothing really surprises him, but he's still a little bit shocked at the conditions on board the ship for the workers in particular. And yeah, he's immediately put in, because he's in a fisheries observer, he's immediately under suspicion, treated with contempt, and which is not unusual, and is put in that difficult position like his predecessor that he still doesn't know what happened to, trying to find out what happened. And of course, as he tries to find out what happened, that leads to the plot of the story, I guess. Yeah.
And one of the things that I feel like shocks him and exposes the reader to this bit of information, as well as the way that the fishing vessel that he's on does their fishing, is the long line. And the bycatch was something that I didn't really know much about, and as our protagonist sort of explores that a bit more, just the way that like seabirds get caught on it. I'd never really thought of seabirds getting impacted by fishing. Could you tell us a bit about the different practices that during your research that you found?
Yeah, I mean, there are different ways of fishing. There's gill netting, which is often illegal in most places, but it's still practiced, certainly in the Mediterranean. And long lining, which, you can have 100-kilometre long lines on these industrial vessels, sometimes more. And otherwise, just nets, so, the big toothfish nets in Antarctica. And that's in the kind of the legal fleet. So he's on a long lining vessel. This is particularly bad for seabirds. The stats about albatrosses and other birds that are caught are quite horrible, really. But naturally, if you're soaking a line, 100-kilometre long line, for 6 or 7 hours, a lot of sharks are caught, a lot of porpoise or dolphins, and a lot of birds are caught when the baits go into the water. So that's something that he's a bit surprised by. But yeah, I mean, bycatch is one of the hidden costs of particularly the industrial fishing fleets, but also all fishing fleets. I mean, when you buy a piece of fish in a restaurant, you might think of it as, it's a fish that's caught on its own and only that species, but of course that's not the case. Depending on what you're ordering off the menu, it can be a ratio of like 1 to 15 sometimes. For example, in Gabon, which is one of the countries in West Africa who has been using Sea Shepherd as a police force, essentially, the president was taken out on a Sea Shepherd vessel, and he was taken from there onto a prawning vessel, which was prawning outside an estuary. And when they counted it up and this is not too unusual, for a kilogram of prawns, 15 kilograms of bycatch. And because they were fishing in an estuary, it was near the mangroves, they were all kind of juvenile little kind of fishes. But because he's a dictator, this guy, he immediately banned the prawning operator. He was able to do that. He was able to, okay, from now on, prawning is banned in Gabon, because he was so horrified. But yeah, bycatch is a big kind of problem in all the fleets, but yeah, generally it's just thrown back overboards. But with sharks, of course, shark fins are valuable, so that's often kept in these vessels, because essentially no one's monitoring what happens in distant water fishing vessels. There's no kind of police force necessarily, and certainly not in international waters. There's absolutely no one to check up. There's a pretty lawless area, and where there are laws, there's no one really monitoring them. So people can kind of do what they want. And again, I want to make the distinction between that and artisanal fishers, the reason I think it's an important distinction is because your average artisanal fisher, it might be a family business. Obviously, if you want to hand your business on to your children or your grandchildren, you want to make sure that you're not destroying your fishery. Whereas a lot of the international or distant water fishing fleet, there's a strange paradox at work. The more fished out these apex species like tuna and marlin and swordfish become, the more valuable they are on the open market. And so it's a lot of the investment that goes into these kind of fleets, aside from the government subsidies, is coming from big finance. So hedge funds are starting to take an interest in it. And of course, this kind of big finance, they want short-term returns. So short-term returns and industrial fishing, bad combination, because it's that colonial method of extraction, basically taking as much as you can, taking everything and then moving on. So when that fishery's stuffed, you move to the next one. Whereas the artisanal fishing or family fishing or traditional fishing or indigenous fishing is about maintaining at least the semblance of balance in the long term. So.
And as like a sustainable resource there for future generations. Yeah. And so one of the things that I'd also like to talk about as well is later on in the novel, you also talk about, earlier on in the novel, copy my notes here, Western occupations of developing countries for their own political measures, which I feel would be fair to say that applies to the fisheries resource as well. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that? It reminded me of The Island of Sea Women. Have you ever read that one by Lisa C?
No.
Fantastic book. The main character is she has a community of female divers, and they are the main breadwinners for their community, but their island is constantly being taken by other countries and used as a weapon, whether it's as a buffer, because it's in South Korea, and the island of Jeju. Not very good with pronunciation.
I know the group, but I haven't read the book yet.
Yeah, and that was something that was a big part of it, was the way that it disrupted, everyone's sort of daily lives. And I felt that with specifically in the book you referenced Guam. Yeah,
I mean it's kind of a tragedy what's happening in places like Africa, but also South America to some extent. So when the exclusive economic zone idea was introduced, so every country would have 200 miles of ocean that they could claim rights over. So the idea behind it was that poorer countries in places like Africa or in the South Pacific would then be able to charge rents basically to allow fishing groups to kind of come into their waters, which is great on paper, but there's a lot of evidence that in countries where corruption is rife, and so the idea was that money could then be used to help develop the country or pay for schools or hospitals or what have you. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of that money doesn't really filter down. It goes into, if it's easy to bribe the fishing minister, with a couple of $1 million, and then that's the way most governments or companies will kind of go. But also, it's not just in Africa. In Europe, there's some good things, like the Lofoten Islands in Norway, where I actually went when I was 18. I hitchhiked up there to get a job on a fishing boat. Someone had said I could get a job up there, but I got there a month too early for the season, so I didn't stay and work on a fishing boat. They still have a cod fishery there, but they mandate that a certain percentage of the cod fishing vessels are sailboats. Totally inefficient way of catching fish, right? Sailboats, but they don't care. They don't want to catch all the fish. They want there to be cod for their grandchildren's generation, their great-grandchildren's generation. And the Faroe Islands, similarly, they decided that they would ban industrial fishing vessels from their waters, and so just local fishers would catch the fish. But unfortunately for them, a lot of the Dutch vessels complained to their Prime Minister, and the Dutch Prime Minister threatened to tear up the Faroe Islands free trade agreement with the EU if they did that, and so the Faroe Islands had to back down and allow industrial fishing vessels into their kind of water. So there's good stories and bad stories, but there's a very neo-colonial kind of taint in the way that a lot of the big kind of industrial fishing fleets operate in places like Africa as well. So the colonial period might have ended, but in terms of the bribery and the extraction of resources beyond kind of what is reasonable, it's really common. It reminds me of, I mean, in some of the East African countries I lived in during the colonial period, you know, the British would just take all the gold out of Tanzania and leave absolutely nothing for, you know, future kind of industries. It's a little bit like that, but with the fishing industry, it just goes under the, you know, a genteel layer of, yeah, we're paying our rent here, but does it go through to the people who are affected? And why, if that's the case, why are you not giving any jobs to locals? And if that's the case, why are you fishing within sight of the shore? And why are you running over African fishing boats when they go near your nets? That kind of thing.
And so you're going to do another novel potentially exploring the fishing industry again? Is that with the potentially the Sea Shepherd? Not
necessarily. I'm planning one, and I should say, so this is I've been talking about a lot of the bad and the sad things about the fishing industry, but I have written this. I have designed this book to be read as a crime novel as well. So if you don't give a shit at all about the industrial fishing industry, you should be able to read it as a thriller, I guess. And my kind of beta reader for that is my dad. Like, he doesn't really care about the fishing industry or anything like that, but he loves thrillers. And so he gave me the thumbs up the other day. Great thriller. And so that's kind of the idea with this kind of material. You can package, the idea is you can package up something that is about something real in my case, and something in my case that I'm passionate about, but it's not designed to be didactic. It's not about me standing on my soapbox and preaching to readers, because that just doesn't work. But if you tie it up in a story that hopefully takes the reader on a bit of a journey, you can maybe take readers on a bit of a journey to places and readers who might normally go, I don't want to know anything about that stuff, but if it's a good crime novel, well, I might kind of read it. The next version of the next Cutler novel is actually set in Fremantle Port, and that's coming out next year. And so I'm sticking with the maritime theme, but not necessarily about the fishing industry. And that's about the kind of cocaine gold rush which is going on in Australia at the moment, which some of you may know about. It's a really big thing, and it's not necessarily, I mean, I have friends who love cocaine, and that's great. They're happy because the cocaine is increasing in purity and the price is going down. But there's literally a gold rush going on at the moment, because, you know, a kilo of cocaine in America can get it for about as cheap as $15,000 a kilo, and in America it's between $40,000 or $50,000 a kilo. Anyone want to guess what it is in Australia, wholesale? Up to about $300,000 a kilo. So what do you think every organised crime group in the world is thinking? You know, Australia and New Zealand and Japan are like the last kind of frontier where the prices are ridiculous. And so there's a lot of cocaine coming in at the moment. Very hard for the coppers, for customs to do anything about it, because there's lots of different ways to get it in the country. And like I say, it's good for people that love cocaine, but unfortunately everywhere this has happened, it has led to some really bad things, like massive corruption on the docks. It's an extreme example, but a lot of people in Europe are worried that Belgium might become Europe's first narco state, because you end up in a situation, there's so much money involved. So like in the good old days, you might pay a copper or a stevedore $500 to turn the other way when something's coming through. But now you can pay someone $1 million, particularly if you're paying $300,000 a kilo. The money is unbelievable. Like if you get a ton of cocaine into Australia, you're talking like $600 million. It's in ridiculous amounts of money. And so you can, the amount of money you can outlay as bribes are enormous. So this has led in countries where this has happened to massive corruption. The bribe of the bullet, judges, lawyers, police, men and women getting threatened, assassinations, the kind of thing we've seen in countries like Ecuador, coming to a port near you, you know.
I'd like it to stay fiction, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm happy to read about it in fiction. Wouldn't that be nice? And you'd said in an interview with Freo Press that while your primary focus is to entertain readers, you also freight story with examinations of the nexus between organised crime, politics and business, which you absolutely nail in all your books, and it sounds like the next one's going to do that as well. Why do you think readers love crime so much? Bringing it back to the novel form, away from the very depressing real-life politics of the present time, why do you think we love crime so much?
Yeah, I think because it's a really broad church, like all the genres. I mean, there's the cosy crime, where crime is often thought of as a matter of individual deviance, you know, and so there's a criminal, usually from a kind of a middle-class background. They break the law, and a clever investigator solves the puzzle because it's puzzle solving. So that gives the reader a very specific kind of pleasure, trying to solve the puzzle as the investigator does. Then there's the crime that's kind of darker material but is still about individual deviance, and that's like the Scandinavian noir crime. Some of you may have read that, where you have a really evil genius criminal, which if you ask most coppers, are most criminals evil geniuses? They will tell you no, that's not the case. But of course, to show that your protagonist is brilliant and clever at sleuthing, you need an antagonist who is just as brilliant. So that sets up a battle royale. So that gives a particular kind of pleasure as well. Who's going to come out on top? And then there's the kind of the noir or the hard-boiled genre, which I like most of all, and that is a little bit more about social crime. That's less about individual deviance. I've taught in the West Australian prison system for a long time, and also overseas. I mean, I've met lots of murderers, and they're no more interesting to me than any other people. So the genre I like looks at crime as less a matter of individual deviance and more of a structural kind of thing, the way that crime is embedded into lots of our institutions. And, you know, I started off writing about probably Perth's most notorious unsolved murder, and that was the murder of Shirley Finn in 1975. And that was when I was working at Casuarina Prison. One of my students his name was Shane Finn, and he was Shirley Finn's. For those of you who don't know the story, Shirley Finn was a brothel madam in the 1970s who was murdered because she was basically threatening to name the detectives that she was paying. There was a system of green lighting, and we don't need to go into it except that lots of coppers I've spoken to over the years are quite nostalgic for that period. And it sounds funny, but, you know, there's an element of pragmatism to it. You know, their idea is like it's better to have organised crime than disorganised crime. It's better to know who's who in the zoo, so that they can report back to you. You can put other people out of business. If anyone is a bad actor, then they can be removed. So policing. I mean, the problem is not necessarily with police and policing. The problem is with prohibition. When you prohibit something that people want, then there's going to be a black market for it, like cocaine, right? Which makes the coppers and the government's job very, very kind of difficult. So in the 70s, there was, you know, greenlit brothel madams, before the TAB, greenlit SP bookmakers, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, Shirley Finn was one of the greenlit madams in Perth. She was going to name names. She was murdered. And so Shane asked me to write about that, his mother's murder, but no one... I thought it was going to be a non-fiction book. No one was prepared, beyond a few people, to talk on the record, because people were still quite afraid. for good reason, I think. And so I decided to write it as a novel, and that was great because suddenly I said, I'm not going to record anything, just tell me your stories. And I ended up interviewing about 50 or 60 different people and trying to triangulate, because there's a lot of myth and legend around that particular story. But in the process, I got to meet so many fascinating characters. I mean, I love reading, but I also love oral storytelling. So I met some amazing characters from Perth in the 1960s, 1970s and 1980s. There were so many stories left over that they sustained me for another, I don't know, three crime novels, Frank Swan novels, and into the future as well. So those novels, while they're kind of crime novels, it's kind of about solving a mystery. They're also about the way that they're about that kind of arrangement in Western Australia between policing practices, organised crime, politics, and how that kind of whole thing worked and how that affects ordinary individuals and particularly people who step out of line, I guess. So that's the kind of social crime, I guess, yeah. Alternate history, I don't know what you call it, but...
Thank you, that was excellent. That was definitely a very experienced crime writer, done plenty of panels with other crime authors type of response, so thank you. And then one of my last-ish questions is, which bit did you have to cut out? Because we love hearing about killing your darlings, and you said that part of what you do is editing it to make sure it's the right balance so that someone can just read it as a ripping thriller rather than getting bogged down in social commentary if that's not their jam. How do you tread that line?
Yeah, I mean, I think about the research that I'm not going to put in, but because I write pretty blind, like I don't plan, because I have a full-time job, so I don't want writing to feel like a job for me. I need to feel joy when I'm writing, even if I'm writing about quite dark stuff. And for me, the joy is being surprised by my characters and being surprised by where the story goes. And so I never know when I open my computer what I'm going to be writing about that day, and I certainly have no idea where a story is going to go. And that excitement, it's a little bit selfish, but that's what kind of gives me pleasure. But also, like, I was brought up quite old school, and that's like do something once and do it well. So I tend to try and get my first draft. I mean, I can still hear my dad's voice. Do it once, do it well. Like, you know. So whatever I do, I try and do that. And so I try and get my first draft as polished as possible, even though that sounds impossible because I have no idea where it's going. I kind of work slowly enough, and I'd probably go mad if I got to write full time. Then I would be quite wasteful and whatnot. But I end up with a reasonably polished first draft, and then it's just about cutting, unnecessary dialogue, because I love getting my characters talking. That's what I usually have to cut. It's like, shut up now. We don't need to hear any more of that. That's usually what I end up kind of cutting. But when I'm writing it, that's what makes me happy, because when my characters are talking, I'm learning a little bit about them. I enjoy that. But yeah, it's not necessarily, the reader doesn't necessarily need to hear about what they had for breakfast. And,
Would you say that that's the best thing then about being a writer, that moment of discovery as you reach the page?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what keeps me going back to it. It's got to be fun for me. Like I say, I don't want it to feel like a job. It can feel hard. It's not necessarily easy, and I take it very seriously. But yeah, I love. When Paul Cutler gets on the boat, I haven't even thought about who is going to be on the boat as he's literally climbing up the side of the boat to get on the deck. I haven't thought about who's on the other side. Like, are there going to be 3 crew or 5 deckies? Or I meet them. Like, oh, okay, hello. Oh, okay, yeah, I like it. Good, you can, and I kind of meet the story as the reader meets the story, and that's the little perverse, selfish pleasure that I get. But yeah.
They get unveiled to you, just as when we're reading the book, they get unveiled.
Yeah, literally, yeah.
To wrap up, I'd like to ask, even though we kind of already have found out a little bit, what's next for you? So we've got a new Cutler next year.
Yep.
Yep, excellent. Any other projects that you can hint to us?
Yeah, I'm writing another Lee Southern story at the moment. So he's a little bit like Paul Cutler, I guess, in that he's younger. And I'm only about halfway through it, so I don't really know where it's going to go. But it's a strange story already. So it's kind of a locked room. I mean, in a way, I think of Cutler as a prison novel, because everyone's locked on a boat, and whereas normally in a crime novel, like a Frank Swan crime novel, and this is a pretty common trope with crime fiction, if you're writing about quite dark material, you want to leaven it a little bit usually with banter or humorous dialogue or something like that. Wasn't able to do that with Cutler because he's the only person on the boat who speaks English as a first language. So I tried to write about, lyrically, I suppose, about the beauty of the ocean as a kind of counterpoint, a bit of lightness to set against the darkness. And similarly with the Lee Southern one, it's set in a closed environment. So instead of like lots of action, it's a bit of an experiment for me. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but there's only one way to find out, I guess.
Fun to give it a go.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so before we ask audience questions, would you be willing to read us out a passage? Thank you. Show off. Don't have to have your glasses on all the time.
Yeah.
I read too much under the covers with a torch, pretending I was asleep when I was young.
My distance vision is okay, but yeah, I'm getting short-sighted. So yeah, this is where he climbs up the side of the boat. So this is that bit, I guess. So he's just left the safety of the American vessel, the Monterey, which has taken him out to the fishing grounds, and he's going to climb on the Chinese vessel. He doesn't really know what to expect, and as I've just told you, when I was writing it, neither did I know what was going to happen. But anyway, this is him on the way to the boat. David, who's a Fijian crew member. David pushed the throttle on the skiff and it surged from the Monterey toward the east, where the darkness was thicker, woolly on the horizon, and the Shuan lay waiting. The only sign of movement aboard the ship was a boiling at the stern, where water poured from the deck and silvered the ocean. Cutler lit 2 cigarettes and passed one to David, who stared at the profile of the Taiwanese vessel as a rope ladder was thrown from its waist. "You need to change your face," David said, pulling back on the revs as a large swell came at them. "You look like you're going to war." Cutler didn't reply, knowing that David was right. He was going to have to play the part of the young scientist, resolute and idealistic, eager and friendly despite his fears. He didn't have much time to reflect on it anyway, as David sliced a broad arc with the powerful outboards before pulling back on the throttle, surfing the flank of a swell and riding the next with perfect timing, bringing the skiff alongside the Shuan, whose white steel hull rose like a wave that threatened to break upon them. David's cigarette hung from his lips. He shook his head as the smoke rose into his eyes. Cutler hooked his duffel across his shoulders and hoisted the heavy suitcase. Excuse me. "You can climb a ladder with one hand?" David asked. Cutler took his point, adjusted his grip to put his hand through the handle so that the weight of the suitcase was transferred across the back of his wrist. The skiff idled alongside the hull, looming above them, the rope ladder whipping in the swell. Because David wasn't going to say anything by way of farewells, Cutler took the ladder with one hand, the skiff and the hull rising and falling. "Tell Captain O'Riordan that I accidentally packed his book, The Steinbeck, Travels with Charlie. I'll post it back to him." That made David smile. "Travels with Charlie? He's been trying to get me to read that book for years." That's my little joke to James. Yeah, sorry. "Keep it, please, and quickly now. It's dangerous sitting here." Cutler nodded, cinched his duffel tighter on his shoulder, tried to crack an excited smile. "How's my face now?" "You look like a crocodile trying to smile." So I'll leave it there, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I do like the little Thank you for explaining the little reference there. Did you end up reading it or you still haven't?
Apparently it's very good though. Yeah, so I think Steinbeck invented the Winnebago. I mean, I think that's the story. He made so much money off, I think it was Grapes of Wrath, that he, I could, correct me if I'm wrong, but he decided he would travel around America, and he wanted a comfortable kind of van, so it cost a ton of money, but he invented the Winnebago and he travelled around America with his poodle, and apparently a great story, and that's on the cover. A giant poodle.
I didn't realise that. I just was like, oh yeah, dog travel story. Sign me up.
So I think it's a story of backroads America and the people that he meets. And I will read it one day. Maybe I'll take it with me on my holiday. But
If you can track down a copy.
If I can find it. Yeah.
We will hit the lights. We'll get a bit more brightness in here so we don't trip over. And I will sneakily get you to join this table that's nice and tall and standing, and we might get David to do some signing if he's willing. Is that okay?
Of course, happy to do that. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. And just very quickly, I better just also add, next month, last book club of the year. Thank you so much for having us for another year. So we will have Robbie Arnott zooming into us from Tasmania. I have Dusk here for sale. If you're a member, as you know, you get 20% off of the book of the month. And I also have 3 of David's backlist titles. So if you'd like to dive into some of his others and get them signed while you're at it, a very good Christmas gift. I will have those for sale as well.
And can I give Robbie Arnott a plug? Has anybody read any Robbie Arnott books? Yeah. He's such a great young Australian writer, and he's a really good bloke. I was on a panel with him in Tasmania, and he came along and he was looking a bit flustered, and we did the thing, and afterwards he said, I've got to go, and I said, okay, great, thanks, nice to meet you. And his wife had just given birth that morning, and he'd come out just for 2 hours and then he was rushing back, and it was their first kid too. But he's a beautiful writer, really great Australian writer, and I'd read anything by him, but I'm looking forward to reading that. That's coming with me on holiday.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Sri Lanka, yeah. I've never been there before, but I'm looking forward to it, yeah.
Alrighty.